We are strong. We are proud. We are the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado. We build vibrant communities across the state by investing in our people. By the year 2042, 1 of 3 Coloradans will be of Latino ancestry. We must create opportunity so our children, families, and elders can share their stories, feel connected, and give back at all levels of society to shape an inclusive Colorado. We are your trusted partner, your ambassador for transformative change. Somos familia. Let's create our collective power together. Connect with us at latinocfc.org.
Celebrate with us on October 13, 2022, as we celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado at the Denver Art Museum. Don't miss it.
This is the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, Our Story series. This series elevates and addresses issues pertinent throughout Latino communities in Colorado and beyond. We believe transformative change is possible when the collective power of the Latino community comes together.
Hi, I'm Rachel Griego with the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, LCFC, and I want to welcome you to the Our Story podcast. This episode, La Lucha, Liberated Action, features a dynamic panel of community warriors moderated by Carlos Martinez, President and CEO of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, and features Dr. Lilia Cervantes of Denver Health, Vinny Cervantes, Executive Director of Dasher in Denver, Patricia Miller, Executive Director of Alianza Norco in Fort Collins, and Tonette Salazar, Senior Vice President of Government Relations for Strategies 360. They share how they have stepped up their leadership to create change in the Latino community, locally, statewide, and across multiple sectors. In their own unique way, each have challenged affected systems and have fought for equity and amplified the voice of the voiceless.
Welcome to our last part of the Our Story Forum. Today, I'm really honored to be your moderator for La Lucha, Liberated Action. To be able to go ahead and moderate and facilitate a conversation with 4 amazing leaders throughout Colorado to talk about how they elevated their leadership to really create transformative change in their areas of a field and in their community. So today we have with us, and I'm going to do a brief introduction, and I'm going to allow them to go ahead and share a little bit about their story. To my immediate left is Patricia Miller, the Executive Director of Alianza Norco in Fort Collins. Next to her is Dr. Lilia Cervantes, who is an internal medicine doctor at Denver Health, and also a health policy activist. Next to her, we have Vinny Cervantes, who is the Executive Director of the Denver Alliance for Street Health Response, who will share some of his story, also bringing health out into the streets. And lastly, we have with us Tonette Salazar, who's the Senior Vice President of Government Relations for Strategies 360, who will talk about her leadership in the political field. So, thank you very much for being part of our panel today, all of you. I have been looking forward to this session like you don't know how. I mean, this morning when I was thinking about it, I'm like, should I ask him this? Should I ask him this? And my list of questions just got longer and longer and longer because you have amazing stories to tell. And so today, it'll be my job to really go ahead and get those stories out of you and share that with our community to inspire them, to motivate them, to make that chispa that you all did in elevating your leadership. So the first question, since we're going to spend a lot of time later on about kind of like the work that you did, I want to go back in time a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was growing up for you? What kind of a child were you? And when did you start shaping your thoughts about social justice? So, Tonette, we're going to start off with you.
Well, it will come as no surprise to anyone. I was very headstrong as a child, and I wasn't always right, but I was always sure. And I think it was that confidence and headstrongness that serves me well now as an adult, but maybe didn't do so quite as much when I was a younger child. But learning the lessons of patience, and there's ways to speak with people that resonate better than others, and your words matter and your words are important. And those were some lessons I learned as a child that I think have served me well as an adult, but they were tough lessons to learn growing up.
Well, thank you. Lily?
Yeah, so I actually was born in Denver. I grew up in Denver County, Westwood and Valverde, and I attended Valverde Elementary School. And growing up, I would say the things that most shaped my life is seeing how hard my parents worked. We were at times homeless. My mom had 2 separate janitorial jobs. My dad worked hard to learn English and then work on his PhD. And one of the things that he always taught me was that through education comes power. And through that power, you can begin to make change in your community. And they also taught me a lot about courage, making sure that you sort of stand by what you believe, regardless of the consequences. And so I would say, early on in life, growing up with poverty and with English as my second language in my neighborhood really shaped my passion for equity and justice.
Well, thank you. Vinny?
Yeah, young Vinny was born in Aurora, Colorado. I've always lived in Colorado. I grew up in, Greenwood Village and Parker. And I like to read. I played hockey a lot. But, in terms of shaping my own values and the ways I interacted with issues, it was really about seeing things that are wrong and realizing that you have to do something about it if you think something is wrong. And that especially came to fruition in high school where, one of my friends was involved in a car accident that unfortunately took the lives of 3 of our other friends. And that was during the summer that killed 6 of our total classmates in our graduating class. And so that whole process and how my friend was treated by the criminal justice system really brought my own sense and value to the issues of restorative justice, restorative practices, and alternative ways to navigate conflict. And when really terrible things happen, how we can address that in a way that promotes healing rather than punishment. And so that's really what brought me to the work that I'm currently doing.
Great. Patricia?
Well, I grew up in El Salvador, so it was probably a really different childhood. I grew up in the middle of a war, and I was a really sensitive child. And we didn't have monitors, apparently, on our TV stations. And so I would see the devastation and the bloodshed of my fellow Salvadorians every night on the TV news. And that was really hard for a sensitive child. But I also saw the resistance and felt the resistance of the people around me. And I was really able to channel that into an internal strength that served me well when we immigrated to the U.S. We were really poor and we struggled a lot. And so coming to the U.S., it taught me a lot about the difference between 2 different countries and how we live and how we make our voices heard. And my people in El Salvador really did that throughout their life. And that resilience, it lives within us, and I draw from that to this day.
So, in our families, especially, if we grew up in oppressed communities or being immigrants, our parents often tell us, just be quiet, don't say anything, and so forth. And, just to be able to not to get in trouble or something, that didn't really cause any trouble. But obviously, all of you have caused a lot of wonderful trouble. So was there anything kind of like in your cultural upbringing that you had to unlearn to really step into your leadership, into your own power? And any of you can start.
It's a hard question, but I will share that growing up, my family was very humble. And oftentimes didn't feel like we were deserving of certain things. Like I've shared with some mentees of mine that we were at a restaurant once and I wanted ketchup. And my mom was like, nope, don't ask for ketchup. Let's not bother them. And it's interesting because that's something I really had to unlearn. I had to find the power in my voice. The first time I met with my supervisor, I was really anxious about asking for, funding towards a program that I was hoping to launch. But it took sort of putting myself out there again and again and again to find that power within my voice and to really start using my voice for my community. but it was, that sort of feeling of, not being deserving that I had to unlearn.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there's a certain level of shame and exclusion that I grew up with, especially growing up in communities that didn't look like me and didn't share my lived experience and cultural background. And that, kind of was exemplified at one point when my sister and I discovered Selena, and my sister wanted to be Selena for Halloween. And my dad, he said that this community won't understand who that is and how significant she is. So there's a level of that shame and exclusion that I felt that I think, I really had to unlearn, and especially moving to Denver and getting connected with more Latino communities and led organizations that really felt a lot more like home than what growing up did. So that was a huge part of like unlearning, a lot of that piece of my background and yeah.
Lily, you said something that was really key that really resonated with me. Because I experienced a lot of that as well, was putting yourself out. At least within my own story, I had to be the translator for my parents all the time. And it was like putting yourself out in a lot of things, both, in school and other things. And I think what was the most difficult for me is there was really no like role model for me about, putting yourself out. So can any of you talk about where did you get your strength and your energy for constantly having to putting yourself out? And what did that help you become tougher? You said you were like tough and, whatever. But, what does that putting yourself out all the time do to us in our development, especially at an earlier age?
I think maybe my experience growing up in southern New Mexico and Las Cruces was a little bit different. It was not unusual for Latinos to be business owners, to be in positions of power. And when I came to Colorado for college, it was a very different experience. And so I grew up putting myself out there. It was okay to be out there, to succeed, to be on the radar screen. And I felt like when I came to Colorado, it was very different. It was the expectation that you did not do that what many have talked about already, being humble and not drawing attention to yourself. So I felt almost like I was in an environment that I had never experienced before and had to learn all over how to adjust and adapt to operate in this type of an environment, as opposed to the way that I was brought up.
I was that child that was interpreting for my mom and calling, the electricity, the gas, calling the schools. And I learned really early on that if I didn't advocate for myself, nobody else was going to. And that was as a 13-year-old child. And I started working as a 14-year-old. And so under the table, of course, and always around immigrants. And so I knew that from early on, if I didn't speak up, nobody else was going to. And that really went against the being nice as a girl that I learned in El Salvador, is you have to be nice and you have to be quiet.
Okay.
And so that was exactly the opposite of those things.
So when kind of like in your life did you start kind of like expanding your thinking about kind of like looking at the injustices and saying kind of like, can I be someone that can, combat that? I can make a difference. When did that start coming about for you all?
So I can share that the Sentinel event, or the Chispa,
Okay.
for me was being a clinician and taking care of the undocumented community with kidney failure. Because when I started working in Colorado, undocumented immigrants with kidney failure could not receive dialysis 3 times a week. They instead had to come to the hospital when they were at the brink of death. And it was becoming a very close friend with one of my patients, Hilda, who had 2 little boys. She was basically coming to the hospital once a week, near death. And out of love for her boys, she decided to withdraw from dialysis because they were seeing their mom near death on a weekly basis. And in that process, we worked with her to find an amazing adoptive family for her boys. She passed away on Mother's Day in 2014. And after she passed away, I felt so much anger at the injustice. And it was too morally distressing to continue to provide that type of care for the other 100 or so undocumented immigrants with kidney failure. And it was at that point that I decided I'm going to put myself out there and I'm going to change this. I'm going to figure it out. And I tried advocacy first at the state level and then realized that I could use research as the engine to begin to sort of move this forward in connecting with other stakeholders to create change. And so for me, it was honestly that Sentinel event that made me realize, oh my God, I just changed this. What else is next? How else can I address the injustice?
So Lily, let me just go a little bit deeper on that, because I love that story about Hilda, and how it also just kind of like brought out another side of Lilia. Because you were also on like a 5-year journey to help change Medicaid for undocumented individuals. How do you stay on course for 5 years? You know, because a lot of times, sometimes we're like, will this ever really change? Will I ever really make a difference? And you stuck with it for 5 years to make systemic change for folks. So how was that journey, that 5-year journey for you? And how did you maintain your motivation?
That's a tough question, because I oftentimes felt like I wasn't going to change this. But before Hilda passed away, we went out to dinner and we had nopales. And people with kidney failure can't eat nopales because they have potassium and other things they're not supposed to eat. But when we sat down, she ate nopales and she said, "This is my last meal." And she said, "I want you to change this for the other people, just like me in the state." And I decided from that moment on that I was committed, that I was going to push and push and push through research, through connections with media, by highlighting this issue, by engaging with anyone willing to listen about Hilda's story. And it's been so incredible, because in that I found courage. I realized that I didn't care if I lost my job. I didn't care if people hated me. In fact, after one of the publications in a medical journal, someone reached out to say, "Thanks for publishing this. You've shown me that you are an anchor baby and all of you need to be deported." And instead of feeling upset about that, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm just that much more angry and I am going to change this. And so it just, I think that there have been challenges along the way. I'm sure many of you have experienced challenges, but one can use those challenges to really fuel yourself, to propel yourself forward, to create change and more change. And so that, Hilda was my chispa, and I'm continuing on that journey because of her.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that story. We'll come back a little bit later with a little bit more about that. But Vinny, you've been doing some really amazing work also. And to see how that incident that you shared with us earlier, how that sparked to make some changes and really having you step up and doing things a little bit differently. Would you mind sharing a little bit about the work that you do in the STAR program and how you just stepped up and what motivates you to continue to do that type of work? And I don't really want to share your story, so I don't want to, but I think you have an amazing story to share. So if you can just share a little bit about that chispa that really got you going in doing the wonderful work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, so we have so many movements going on right now on a national level and a local level that we see these names come across the TV or social media of people who have been lost through police violence and through the criminal justice system. And that was part of what really got me to engage with those issues and try to seek change in that regard, and some of my own personal experience with that, and so knowing people that are attached to my family that are explicitly racist, that have created harm in our communities around policing. And that really drove me to want to change those issues. And it started with reform, and it started with saying we can do things within the system to change, the way that policing happens, the way that they interact with our community. But really, we can do better than that. We can actually transform the way that conflict happens, the way that crisis happens, and how we respond to it. And that's what drove me to want to bring, a non-police alternative to Denver that was inspired by the Cahoots program in Eugene, which has been successful for 30 years. So we had a model that was provable, that was successful, that actually saved the city money in Eugene, Oregon, $8.7 million per year. That could have been $50 million for Denver. And so that really inspired us to try to do that work in Denver as well.
Can you talk a little bit about what that program does?
Yeah. Yeah, so the STAR program sends a paramedic and a mental health clinician to crisis, 911 calls as alternatives to police, and particularly to substance use issues, mental health crises, and homelessness. It took, really a couple of years to bring it here, but it was the manifestation of so many decades of people saying, we need to do better, we need to do something different in the community when it comes to, safety issues. And the program has now been on the ground for over a year. It's now expanding. They just did a presentation this week that said that we're going to expand to 6 vans, I think 12 responders. We're very proud of that program as an organization with Dasher, that we were one of the first drivers of that program and that we could maintain kind of the community voice in that space. But also it can be better. It can better serve our community. It can better serve the Latino community in particular. Some of the data that's coming back now has severe gaps in how they're serving our community and to what extent they're meeting our needs. And so, again, we're very proud of it, but it can be so much better. And that's what we're working on now. That we're also expanding to other cities. We're currently working with 14 communities across the state to bring a similar alternative to those cities as well. So it's really expanded.
What I really love about what you're doing also with this program, Vinny, is how you're really engaging the community. So, and really making sure that these cities don't take it over and lose that community spirit that you have brought to these programs. So is it challenging to constantly engage the community and making sure that the community is holding cities accountable?
Yeah, I mean, it's the case that they're so often erased. The people that are making the initial demands, the people that are experiencing that direct harm, if they do have their stories heard, they're kind of taken and co-opted in a different way that creates change that the community didn't actually want. And so that happens so often. And we have cities across the country that are reaching out to us about this particular program. The first thing we say is who are you talking to in your own community? It's great you're reaching out to us and wanting to, get inspired by the work that we're doing in Denver, but who are you talking to in Long Beach and New York and in Chicago? Who are you talking to on the ground? And so in Colorado here, the big challenge is that, on one hand, it's getting the voices out there. But, once we have folks who are talking who aren't often heard, we find that they don't stop talking. And that's really incredible to see people that, don't typically have their stories heard or acknowledged, that they share so much with you. And that's what really we've learned throughout the state is there's so many people who are experiencing harm, who want to see something different, who haven't seen, people recognize their communities. And that's really what's driven a lot of the change.
Well, what a beautiful way to go ahead and empower a community, but not just empower them, but build their own power to go ahead and create that change. So thank you. We'll come back. Tonette, in having you being part of the panel, I was very intrigued about talking to you about how Latinos step up in the political field. Because sometimes, we are very distrustful of government. We sometimes don't see ourselves in the political realm. But that tenacity that you bring, that you shared with us about yourself, really took you in a way of doing lobbying, about working on campaigns, about really getting into circles that sometimes Latinos don't go into that. You were very instrumental in helping to pass our asset bill to ensure that undocumented students could pay in-state tuition. You're very involved in K-12 education and higher education, among a lot of other issues that are pertinent to our community. But can you share with us a little bit about how you navigated this field that so many of us are intimidated by, or that it's not something that we even think about going into?
Sure. Like I said earlier, nobody ever told me I didn't belong there.
Okay.
And so when that sentiment arises, it's more about redefining that narrative, because who decided who belongs there? In Colorado, there's a rich history. There was a longtime senator when Colorado was first achieved statehood who helped draft the Constitution in English, Spanish, and German. And so the Latino community is rooted in Colorado since the inception of statehood. And so for someone to say that we don't belong there is a narrative that someone else has created, and people can choose to believe it or not to believe it. When you look around, it's difficult to not see people who look like you in decision-making spaces. Unfortunately, as we progress further and further, we're starting to see more Latino elected officials at the local level, at the state level, hopefully soon at the federal level, but also having people who understand the community's issues and engage with the community in ways that, Vinny and Lilia have said, so that they understand the issues and can work hand in hand with the community to develop those solutions. So oftentimes we have a solution almost in search of a problem. And Vinny, as you mentioned with other states, you ask them, have you talked to the community? That's often what I say. When a solution is brought forward, who have you spoken with in the community that has identified this issue and has identified this solution as one that will work? The other part of it is making sure that the community understands the space that they're operating in and that we set them up for success. Making sure they understand, how does a bill become a law? Where can they interject their voice and their participation in the process? What can they do to help persuade or inform or educate? And it's a combination of individual stories combined with data to show the magnitude of the issues and the problems. And so it's a combination of owning the space, redefining the narrative, and preparing people to engage in this arena by setting them up with education and understanding so it's less intimidating.
So you mentioned the word narrative several times in your comments right now. I can't imagine what it must be under the Gold Dome, to be able to navigating so many personalities, so many misunderstandings about Latinos. And how do you contribute to building our narrative under the Gold Dome?
It again goes back to that partnership with the community, because it's the community's narrative. And I feel like I serve as the bridge between community and policymakers. You meet people where they are on both sides of the bridge to bring them together. For policymakers who maybe don't have the same understanding, it's educating them. It's bringing stories to them of people in their community, of people that they know, people who are impacted. For community members, it's understanding where policymakers are in their own world, in their journey, and what is their background, and giving grace to both sides to understand that this is a learning process and it's a relationship building process. And instead of being confrontational, it's more about how can we help each other come together to find solutions.
Great. Well, thank you. And lastly, Patricia, I remember the first time I met you, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And you were someone who was very involved in high tech and the technology world. And then all of a sudden you said, I'm leaving all this and becoming an executive director. I'm going to start a small immigrant organization in Fort Collins. And just recently, you were extremely instrumental in passing the Legal Defense Fund up in Fort Collins, which I'm sure was a lot of work. But tell us a little bit about your story about leaving the professional world and just saying, I'm going to do something. What was your chispa to go ahead and make that change and do the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, the way that you tell it, it sounds so easy and so linear, but no story is ever linear. Right. And my chispa is that the work that we're dealing with is life and death. Everything that we are trying to do for community is so that their lives are better and so that their lives don't end prematurely or unjustly. And it's based on this system of, white supremacy and racism and colonialism that we've lived through in the places that we come from, no matter where we've come from. And I think where I was in my comfortable tech position at work and managing, it didn't mean anything to me. It didn't mean anything to my family. I was fulfilling the promise of the immigrant who made something of herself, but it didn't mean anything to me. And so that launched, all of the things that I've been able to do. And it was really the narrative of immigrants are rapists, they are violent, they are taking from our communities. Where in my experience, we were exactly the opposite. We were giving to our communities without asking for anything back. We were powering our economy. And we were innovating in ways that were changing the world. And people weren't acknowledging that. And so that really lit that fire within me to say, how can I be involved in change and advocacy and the one-on-one client work that we do? And it's been really hard. It's been really beautiful. But it's humbling, right? Because then you come around a panel like this and you're like, what am I doing here? And it's listening to your community and saying that one story is going to change what I do from here on out. It's going to fuel me. And the way that I'm going to focus on that is through the podcasts I listen to, the books that I read, and the people that I surround myself with. And those are the people that inspire you, the coalitions that you build that power the change.
Well, thank you, all of you, for sharing your chispa and your story that goes along with that chispa. We're going to take a break, a short break. But when we come back, we want to be able to go ahead and really talk more about kind of like your character, your attitudes. What did you go through personally in really elevating your leadership? And we all sometimes have butterflies in our stomach. So I want to know what kind of butterflies go through your stomach sometimes when you're put in situations that you're like, oh my God, what do I do? And so forth. But we'll talk about that when we come back. So stay tuned.
This podcast was brought to you by the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, LCFC. Thank you for joining us today for the Our Story podcast, where Latino lived experience meets action. Mil gracias to the moderator, Carlos Martinez, and the panel, Dr. Cervantes, Patricia Miller, Vinny Cervantes, and Tonette Salazar. This series was made possible through the support of Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, Colorado Health Foundation, Molson Coors, and University of Colorado. Production credits to Emmy-winning producers Truce Media Collective. To learn more about the work of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, check us out on the web at latinocfc.org and by helping us make transformational change through your financial support. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at LatinoCFC.
This is the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, Our Story series. Next up, Episode 8, La Lucha, Liberated Action, Part 2. Join us again as we resume the journey of 5 Latino community warriors as they continue to share how they each step up their leadership to create change in the Latino community locally, statewide, and across multiple sectors.